Hello and a very warm welcome back to Widowed AF. You're here with your host, that's me, Rosie Gilmoss, and joining me all the way at 5 a.m. in the morning from California is Debbie Weiss. Hello, Debbie.
Hello, Rosie.
And thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I know a little about your story because you sent me an application form, and I do a little research before these interviews, but I would prefer for the audience to hear it from you, and I always do like to hear kind of the story fresh on mic, as it were, because you get the kind of natural response then. So you've been actually a paid up member of the Widow Club for a little longer than most of my guests. And I will just sound like you have written a book, haven't you? And you have a really successful blog about being widowed, which is called Widowed and Hungover. Is that it?
Actually, I haven't blogged for a while, but I was a blogger soon after my husband died, and my blog was called The Hungover Widow.
The Hungover Widow, sorry. I knew it was
still
close.
On my website.
And it's your email address, isn't it? Because I looked at it and I was like, oh.
Yes, it is.
So we're going to talk about that as well, Debbie. But if you don't mind, just give me either a whistle stop or a fully in-depth tour of what brought you into the club nobody else wants to be a member of.
Sure. Well, I'd known my late husband since I was 7, and he was 11. We were family friends. His mom and my dad were both scientists here in Northern California. We kind of got thrown together over the years until it sort of clicked when I was 17 and he was 21, and I needed a date to my senior prom.
Oh,
so
this is like a rom-com.
It kind of was, yeah, yeah. It was a nice story, and
apart from the ending, I suppose, yeah.
So we were together ever since, and we went through. He was an engineer in the Silicon Valley. Again in Northern California, and I went through law school. I'm an attorney, and everything was fine. I retired at 40. We didn't have kids, and then when he was around 50, he worked very hard, and he came home one day and said, "Well, there's something on my chest that isn't healing. I'm going to go to the doctor." And apparently he'd waited a long time because he had to wait for his software product to ship for the year. That was his highest priority. And it turned out he had metastasized male breast cancer.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's very rare for men.
You are my first guest to have lost somebody to male breast cancer. It is rare, isn't it? It's not something, I don't think I've met anybody who's lost somebody to that before. Gosh. And of course he left it. He's a bloke, right?
Right. Exactly. And he's an engineer, so he was particularly blokey, you might say.
Geeky? I'm married to a tech guy. It's cool. Geeks rule the world.
So we had some good years left, but in the I'd say about the fall of 2012, he started to decline, and it was very rapid. He went from a walker to a wheelchair. And eventually he passed in April of 2013. So that was a little over 10 years ago.
Wow.
Actually coming up on 11.
So you really didn't get very long from diagnosis to losing him then. Sometimes I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse when it comes to cancer, because it's, I haven't experienced it personally, but I have spoken to many people who have watched that awful decline. And it must just be awful to watch somebody who is, the kind of male strong figure in your life just decline in front of you like that. And I'm so sorry that you experienced that. I really am. So if you don't mind, going back, nearly 11 years, what was life like that in terms of grief support? Because even in the 6 years that I've been widowed, it's come a long way. And I'm thinking even just 11 years ago, there wouldn't have been the kind of plethora of support groups and online support and all that sort of thing that we take almost for granted now.
Well, I did get grief counseling through my local, my healthcare agency. And the therapist was really good. She was extremely helpful. But I didn't have much grief support until I started reaching out. we hadn't have kids. I have a very small family. At the time, my dad and my stepmom both were having their own health problems. I'm an only child. My husband, his name was George. George was an only child.
Sorry, we didn't mention George's name, did we? Sorry, George.
No. Actually, I think his mother might have been a bit of an Anglophile because his name was George Albert.
Oh, definitely then. Yes. How royal.
And she was Chilean, so that was particularly surprising. Okay. So, yeah, but I was very much alone. And the thing that did help me was ultimately I went to my local synagogue for community, and the rabbi offered me grief support, and that was very helpful. But I was very isolated when I lost George, and that made it even more difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting because having had 3 young children myself, I experienced the loss and the ensuing kind of carnage, I guess, for want of a better word, that comes from that, especially when you're navigating it with children. But doing this, I suppose perhaps I was guilty of thinking it would be easier without children, and that to lose your partner without children, you could process your own grief and you weren't carrying all this extra grief. But I think I've changed my mind a bit. Not saying either is worse than the other, but you lose your other half. You lose your best friend, and especially if there's just the 2 of you, that's a real loss, isn't it? And every single day, I've got 3 little replicas of Ben, even the girl, and I was kept busy. I couldn't lie in bed and drink gin, which is very much what I wanted to do. I had to do the school runs and make sure that there was at least something edible in the house. I think my kid ate like fairy sprinkles for breakfast once, but we don't judge the grieving. And so hearing that kind of isolation that you felt, and I think perhaps other people are even guilty of it. Well, there's no kids, so how do I support? And particularly if you are a fairly, independent woman, you're a lawyer, you're not. So I suppose what I'm trying to say in a very roundabout way is this facade that we can put on to the outside world. It's only when we are able to say, I need help, that it comes, isn't it? People sort of offer what they think we need in the very early stages, but actually it's the continued support and somebody to talk to that is so important all the way through, actually.
I agree completely, because George and I didn't have many friends. When he passed, we were very isolated. We by choice, we were pretty antisocial. We were both introverts. In retrospect, that seemed a very foolish choice. But so I had to start kind of from scratch in terms of trying to find a community. And it would have been better if I'd had a support group. I had a few friends from the gym or something. And the best thing for me was somebody who would go on a walk with me once a week. I had a couple women. We weren't really close before he died, but at least, they'd said, hey, let's, a couple times, let's go for a walk. Let's do this in a couple weeks. And something that was ongoing was extremely helpful. It's weird in retrospect, but after some months, I wound up joining a couple social groups. We have Rotary here; it's a service group, and I had George's old sports car. And I'm not a car person, but there was a local car club that I wound up speaking with, and I wound up joining these groups and going to things because the car club had a Saturday morning breakfast, so there were people, and it was very lively. And afterwards, they usually did something car related. But, I had something to do on Saturdays at the beginning. And then the Rotary Club had a weekly dinner. And again, that wasn't really my group. But once a week, I was out, I was having dinner, and a few of the people in the group were my neighbors, and they were very kind people. And I sort of had some recurring things where I was with people. And I was doing something besides sort of in the evening, sitting alone in my living room with George's massive, massive home theater system. And, wondering what am I going to do?
Yeah, I can very much relate to this because I did have quite a wide circle of friends. I think had it been the other way around, Ben would have struggled more. But I was still very much in the school run, the nursery drop, the baby groups, all these things that bring other humans into you, other adult humans. And I love that you joined the car club, actually. I think that shows real balls just to go, all right, I'm going to try something completely different and I'm going to expand my social circle, because it is so isolating being widowed. And even with a fairly wide social circle, I actually don't see that many of them anymore, They gradually dropped away. And I think initially you're almost a bit toxic. People sort of don't want you around. But tell me a little bit more about sort of, because I know you mentioned a little bit about online dating. Are you happy to talk a bit about that today?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, because that is again a really interesting topic, because people think that we are kind of robots, and when our spouse dies, we lose everything below the waist, right? So the idea that we are searching for this human contact and the physical relief, pleasure, some joy somewhere in this kind of stark wilderness can result in some judgment. And so I'm really grateful of people that are prepared to talk about that phase. So in your own time.
Sure. Well, actually, that's what I wrote my book about, was dating after widowhood, because it was so surreal. But way before I wrote a book, though I was writing, about 14 months after my loss, I went online and I joined a group called J-Date, which was for Jewish people. And I'm not religious, but I figured online dating was so crazy, I would join something that seemed a little more moderate, maybe a little tamer. And I started to meet people, and it was scary. I joke that I wrote my book to help other widows, but I joke that I wrote my book because I had to warn other, at least U.S. widows, about the exceedingly poor quality of available middle-aged men.
I'm hearing as much. I'm hearing as much from my fellow widows.
Yeah, it's interesting because us widowed folk, when we die, I mean, when our husbands die, we've had long relationships. We know what that's like. We're quite capable of love, of sustaining a relationship, and probably being a grown up. We've been with a partner, and we've sadly seen them through death. But a lot of these guys are sort of stuck in adolescence, or I joke that a lot of the first dates, the only good thing about them was that you could truly tell why these people had been single for, sadly, most of their lives. So it was definitely surreal.
And you feel quite vulnerable as well. And because you were with your husband since you were 17, excuse me, which is 17 and 21 is actually the ages that John and his wife were when they got together. And she died at 37. Ben and I were a little bit older, but not much. But I'm hearing this idea, this kind of thing where you meet as children almost, young adults. You build the building blocks of life. You go off, you get your qualifications, your jobs, or in my case, you have your family. And then suddenly, well, what now? And you're right. Divorced men are not the same breed. And I think when you've been with somebody a long time and you love them very much, you have very high standards. And you're constantly sort of comparing to what you lost. I mean, I don't anymore, I hasten to add, but you do. And you're just looking thinking, oh, God, is that what's out there? I'd rather be single forever. And then a gruff northerner walked into my life and that all changed. But yeah, in fact, a friend of mine, one of the guests of the show, has sent me today a picture of a guy on a dating app to show me what the calibre of men is out there. I won't be cruel and share it, but I don't think there's much better in England, if I'm honest.
I've heard that from women I know in England, because I've talked to a bunch of different people in connection with the book, and some have said, yep, not better.
No, not better. So I'm thinking early days of online dating, and well, maybe not so much over there. We were still relatively fresh to it. So you've gone for a Jewish website. Lulu she touted the idea of a classic FM dating website, and I was like, maybe not that far. But yes, the idea of sort of finessing it down. And there is a lady I interviewed on the podcast who's actually set up a dating app for widows. One is called Chapter 2, which is a more sort of relationship-based one. And the other one is called Widow's Fire. And I think you can probably figure out what that one's for.
Yes, I could figure.
And the idea behind that is that you're sort of screened before going into the app. I mean, I can't vouch for it. I never used it. But there is a push to find safer ways for people to date. But I just think you're going to get the same old toads climbing in there, aren't you?
Well, I was on a whole bunch of different sites. Ultimately, I moved off J-Date pretty quickly because there weren't that many people on it, especially where I lived, which was a suburb. I lived about an hour southeast of San Francisco. And and a lot of these guys, again, they seem to have enough issues that I thought I would better find a wider pool, and that there might be a larger percentage who were vaguely sane. Not that
I like that you
really
said
happened,
vaguely.
but I did go on some different sites, and I don't know about England, but in the US, they have terrible names. There's Plenty of Fish,
Oh yeah,
Bumble,
Bumble.
which I know some people like, but it's kind of more like the verb Bumble. And also OK
Tinder.
Cupid, where,
Oh, okay, Cupid. Yes, I think we have that over here.
yeah, no, that was probably the largest and the most successful one for me. And but it's a very dreary process. And,
Yeah. You
and
need quite thick skin,
ultimately,
don't you?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, I interrupt you. You need quite thick skin, and
Yes.
when you're freshly widowed, you haven't actually got very thick skin, have you? So it's not. I don't know. I think we kind of jump into it. I know I looked because I was nosy as much as anything. It didn't exist when I met Ben. I wanted to see what it was about,
Yes.
and I was quite quickly disillusioned with it. But I was very fortunate, and I met my alive husband, and I've been able to kind of have a new, very loving, healthy relationship. But I think if I was now sort of thinking, oh, I'd like to start dating and having to dip my toe into that world, I think, I don't know, it just feels so demoralizing and vacuous. And yeah, I know plenty of people who met their respective other through it. So I don't know, perhaps it just takes perseverance.
I agree completely on perseverance, Rosie. And that's what happened for me. I dated George from high school, and I was a geek. So when I started dating after being widowed, I wasn't really sure what I wanted, especially having just seen the person I loved through cancer. I was up for a little fun.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, the dating apps, well, unsurprisingly, did not yield as much fun as I would have hoped. In fact, not much.
Oh, how
The people
disappointing.
were so problematic. But I persevered because ultimately I realized I wanted another relationship, and I wanted to be partnered. And I actually have been in a relationship with somebody I met online for 5 years now. So it did work, but it's very much like having another job.
Yeah.
It's a matter of having a good profile that is set up for a relationship. And it's a matter of just screening, and depressing as it is, just going on the site and spending a certain amount of time and a certain very depressing number of hours on the phone screening people. The more I went on, the fewer people I actually met, the
Yes.
more rarefied I made my profile to say, I am looking for a relationship. If you're looking for anything else, I applaud you, but please don't waste your time
We'll come back.
contacting me. Yeah, move on. Yeah,
My
not me.
cousin was doing, oh, sorry, you go
But
on.
it did ultimately work, but it was extraordinarily time consuming. Now I'm retired. I retired very young. And if I were to lose my current partner of 5 years, I honestly don't think I would go back online. That isn't something I would
I'm
do
getting a
again.
lot of cats if I lose another one.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things that I sort of latched onto in there. And one of them is this idea of wanting to be partnered again. And I wrote that down because I can relate to that. Now, I wasn't desperate to be looked after or to have a new dad for my kids. Or what I wanted is I loved being part of a couple. I loved knowing that in this whole wide world, this one person had my back above all others. And that's what the main thing that I lost. I lost that ally, that co-pilot in life. And I think because you have had that, you are open to it and you want it again. Why would we not want it again? And actually, I really admire your perseverance because, yeah, it does sound like a job. Actually, I was going to say my cousin, she was filtering them with video calls. So you'd get a 10-minute video call before she'd agree to a date. And I was like, God, that sounds really mercenary. But she's like, it's the only way. It's the only way. And especially if you have got young kids because you're paying for a blooming babysitter to go on these dates.
Yes. I mean, I agree. I did phone screening. Video calls weren't as popular when I was doing this.
I'm still not a
I
fan, if I'm
really
honest.
kind of sometimes felt you had to see somebody in person, but it took a while, to see somebody in person. There's so many just people who simply wanted to text, or nothing really came of it, or you'd meet somebody for a coffee. Definitely coffee, not a real meal. I learned that the hard way when you're sitting across somebody and you're going, oh my God, I can't wait to get out of here. And they're saying, oh, let's get dessert. Let's have another cup of,
So full.
no, I'm done. Yeah, I gotta go. Yeah, it was painful. It was so so time consuming, but I did want a partner again. My big thing was, I just remember, sitting at home every evening. When you're partnered, you have someone who's with you and you have love, and you're not isolated in the sense that, friends are very important. I certainly realized that as a part of my loss. But I just remember, really, I wanted someone to ask me about my day. It was very important to me in the evenings to have someone to ask me about my day. And I know this is a very odd kind of benchmark, but I wanted to have somebody where on a Monday morning I could say, or Sunday evening I could say, and it's dark, it's cold, to say, could you take out the garbage cans?
Yeah,
So
it
those
is.
were kind of my little benchmarks. I wanted someone to ask about my day, and I wanted someone else to take out the garbage cans when it was dark
Yeah.
and cold at night, or at least, do it sometimes.
I
Have
don't
that
know if you.
option.
I don't know if you do it there, but it's very sexist and stereotypy, but we tend to call them pink and blue jobs. So, for example, the bins would be a blue job, but maybe the laundry might be a pink job, and they're very interchangeable. We're not totally stereotyped. I'm going to move my mic. Hang on. There we go. I've turned the volume up a bit more. And I can remember getting the lawnmower out. And at my old house, I had a fairly small garden. And I got this lawnmower out, much swearing and huffing and puffing as I got it out the shed. And then I mowed this little patch of grass, and it took about 10 minutes. And I thought, well, he made a fuss about that, didn't he? And it's all, the male, this is going to be a really tough job, and so you're really grateful. But bins, I'm with you on bins. I hate doing the bin and the cat litter. So, yeah, that's definitely a blue job.
Yeah, I had a home, and again, it had a small garden. Back then I had a smaller home, but it was interesting doing everything by myself. And it was certainly interesting when something went wrong and some contractor came over, and he was sort of this American stereotype. Oh, hey, girly girl, looks like we're going to have to replace all that drywall, probably about maybe $5,000. And, so much of what I dealt with was, I'm a widow, but I'm not a moron.
Yeah. I would have had my law degree, I think, framed in the doorway if I were you.
Yeah. I mentioned it a lot. Back then I mentioned a lot. Yes, I'm an attorney and this isn't going to work. It really came up a lot when I was settling George's estate, and people are like, oh, we can't help you. We need the deceased. It's like, well, he's not coming back. I'm an attorney. I'm sure you've dealt with this before, and I will call you every day until we deal with this now.
You sound like me, actually. That's how I dealt with getting my son in school. I called the contact at the council and said, I'll ring you on the hour every hour then, shall I? Until they answered. But I can also relate to this idea of, trying to call insurers or utility accounts and them saying, well, we can't do anything without a death certificate. And I would say, well, I don't have one because he's lost at sea. And they would then say, okay, well, we can't do anything. And at the time, he had very proudly bought a Land Rover Discovery, one of the big chunky sort of, and we lived, the kids went to a country school, and he was really proud. He could afford this car, and it was the start of the next stage in our family because we just had a baby. And this car cost £650 every month before I drove it off the drive. And they wouldn't stop it because it was in his name. I had no death certificates. And the same for the utility bills, the mortgage. And I had to utilize, or a friend of mine helped me, who is a lawyer, and she took the case to the High Courts, and he was legally declared dead. But it was only the second time this law has been used. So there was a huge amount of uncertainty, but also, and not only are you treated like you're a bit stupid, but I felt infantilized. I had to get my mum to make phone calls for me. And I was a grown woman with my own home and my children. But it took me back to feeling helpless and childlike. And I think you are very, very at risk of being a victim of this because people will take advantage of you, unfortunately. It's the same with the elderly. You're seen as, and actually, I'm thinking dating as well. Lots of people think you're a very rich widow, and particularly if you've retired young. I mean, gosh, there's a lot of additional complexities that people really don't think about. And I think one of those is just how childlike you're made to feel in the early days.
Oh, I agree completely. I felt that so much. The good thing is I'm pretty good at putting that to rest. But
I can imagine, actually.
Yeah, but I can do that. I just turned on my lawyer self, during the day after he passed. During the day, I just took care of it all until it was done. And I did have a death certificate, so I could deal with things. Funny, George had a very expensive sports car because he was a tech guy. And so
Go on, tell me what it was.
I still have it. It's a 2009 Porsche Carrera 4S. It's beautiful. And sadly, we got it when he was diagnosed with cancer because we kind of wanted him to have his dream car. And also as an engineer, he had he had like 3 cars, which is insane. We had this small little house, and I was kind of willing to do anything to get him down to fewer cars. But when he passed, I had this crazy thing with these ridiculous payments, and that was the hardest thing to get in my name. The house, we had a trust. We had, we're organized, pretty organized. Some things, but sadly, George had been in denial when he died, which added another level of complexity. He didn't think he was going to die, so we never prepared things beyond the very basic. So getting the darn car in my name was the absolute hardest. And the first thing I had to pay it off. And once I actually got this straightened out, they were like, "Oh, you can refinance." They were throwing all this money. And at that point, I was just like, "I'm done with this bank." And I actually wound up keeping the darn thing and driving it for a number of years. And I still have it.
Good for you.
But it was funny. I remember doing this, and you'd call someplace, they'd be like, "Oh, well, we're pick something an hour and a half away. Can you just come in?" And it's like, "No, I can't. I'm grieving, and I'm sure you've dealt with people who aren't right next to your office. What do you do?"
Yeah.
It was difficult, but it did help me in the sense that it made me realize that I, in fact, did have all my marbles and that I could stand up for myself. Dating was a different story. It was extremely difficult. Men were quite patronizing, again, which was odd. And, they'd be like, "Well, you'll never find anyone like George, or you can't expect this." And I remember thinking, yes, I can expect that. Not from you, but
no.
I can certainly expect that. I can certainly move on. And it was a little surprising, the number of guys who seemed to think that I was just sort of naively sitting in my house, like, well, someone might take advantage of you.
Waiting to be rescued as well. The Rapunzel up in the tower. That's I had a brief interlude with a man that he said just things like I have an iPhone and he got me a Samsung watch, and I said to my friend, "Oh, but she's going to move over to Samsung." I'm like, "Am I?" And it was that need. That sort of, I guess some men are attracted to women who need saving, right?
Yeah.
I made a quick note that I wanted to just come back to you if you don't mind. You talked here a little bit, just briefly, about it's sort of denial of what was going to happen. But also you talked about getting this dream car, and John and Sarah, she had one good day, this good day that people have when they're terminally ill. And there's a video of her, and they've gone out in the car, and he walked into the Range Rover showroom, and there was the car that she wanted was there on display. She's got, she's attached to tubes and wires and, possibly even in a wheelchair. And he just bought it so that she could have it, to be driven around in it. It had like a massage seats in the back and things. And her sister now has the car because he couldn't keep hold of it. But it's like the final hurrah almost. Yes, you can have this thing that you want that will give you this joy whilst everything else is so horrible. Yes, you can have that car. I like that.
Oh, it was fun. We actually got it when he was fairly soon after he was diagnosed. So he lasted with a lot of functionality for years, much longer than the doctors had expected. So he was driving that car.
I'm sorry, in that case, I've totally misunderstood, because I thought it was very quick. So was it 2012 through to 2013? Just confirm that for me, because I don't want to be wrong.
Oh, he was diagnosed in 2009.
That's
and he didn't really start to decline until 2012. And then he passed in April 2013.
Right, that makes a lot more sense.
He had about 9 months that were really bad. He continued to work up until the week before he passed.
Wow.
And when he got the car, he was still in pretty good shape. Sometimes he was bald, but he was driving through San Francisco in this super wide car. It had the big wide back tires, enormously fast through the city. And it was a little bit nerve-wracking, but he did it perfectly. But he was kind enough. He got the PDK. This was the first year that the car shifted faster than a person. He was a manual stick shift kind of guy. But he even told me he got the automatic transmission for me.
Phew. We've just bought a new car this week. I've actually swapped out. I drive a great big V-Class. It's this 8-seater, and I'm just so
Wow.
sick of it. We have 4 kids, so we don't use it very often. And all I can see is this kind of check sitting on the drive because they haven't depreciated. So I said, let's just go and get a Mini. And I've got myself. I haven't got myself. We've got a little Mini for me to
Oh,
poop.
those are cute.
Yeah, and they do the bigger ones, but it's just funny you say that because he was like, "Do you want stick or automatic?" And I was like, oh, "Automatic! God, I haven't driven a stick for years. I wouldn't know where to start." So, can I, if you don't mind, just ask you a little bit more about the denial, because that must be quite difficult if you are obviously not a stupid woman. So you are processing the medical information, presumably. And how do you manage that if the person who is terminally ill is very resistant to accepting it?
Actually, I didn't handle it very well
Fair enough.
back then. This was hard. George kept me out of his treatment. He chose not to have me to go to the doctor with me. Um, he was the tech guy on a program here in the U.S. called Quicken, and he really managed this program. He was very strong. He described himself as an engineer of almost infinite bandwidth. So he sort of handled all this at the start as if it were kind of another series of irritating meetings.
Right.
You know, he drove himself to and from chemo. He would even grocery shop after, and he chose to keep me out of his treatment. He didn't want me to come to the hospital with him. He didn't want me there for chemo. He didn't want me there for anything.
And how
He
did you
also
feel about that?
excluded. Well, I felt terrible. I'd look at Google. I'd look at his medical notes that he brought home. Once or twice I spoke to his doctor myself, but in general, I really couldn't. And I found out very sadly when he was truly declining and just looking like, I mean, he was disintegrating, and he was a big guy. He was 5'9", 200 pounds, then down to 175. Then, he's probably more like 120, 130. And I was just trying to see what was going on. And it wasn't until he was practically gone that I found out he'd put an order in place that prevented the hospital staff from contacting me directly.
Oh, wow. Okay. Gosh. So that must have felt almost like a bit of a rejection, like you're being pushed away. Forgive me if I'm projecting how I would feel onto you, but I can't imagine that. I mean, like I said, I don't have direct experience, but when John was very poorly in hospital, and thankfully he had the foresight to put me as his primary contact, because we hadn't been together a very long time. And his estranged dad kept trying to ring the hospital. And it all got quite complicated. But I can't imagine not being part of it and feeling quite excluded from John describes it as you are both going on a journey, but you're taking different paths. And you don't know what lies ahead for you. They don't know what lies ahead for them. And you're both frightened for each of you and for yourselves. And I'm just thinking, you probably wanted more closeness. I'm sort of rambling a little bit here, but yeah, that must have been really difficult for you.
It was extraordinarily difficult, and particularly difficult because he didn't want his parents to know. So he demanded that we keep from them that he had cancer.
Oh, that's a big ask.
It was tremendous. I had so much guilt because his parents, he was an only child, and his parents were overall good people. We'd had some issues with them early in our relationship of them being a bit overbearing, but in general, they were good people who loved him. He'd had a good childhood, and they didn't deserve that. I would try to say, maybe you want to spend some time with them. No, not extra time. I think he was trying to save all of us from the inevitable, or maybe didn't believe that there was going to be an inevitable, because it was odd. He was so smart and clear-eyed, and then ultimately he just was in denial. And it was odd because, again, I was the person who was going to have to make the decisions when he couldn't. So it was odd because he'd always been very protective of me. He was 4 years older. My mother died when I was 10, and she died at the same hospital where he was getting treatment. So I know he was trying to protect me, but I think ultimately, I think the cancer may have affected him in some way, and his going into denial was a kind of mental illness.
Yeah, it does seem to take so much more than the physical body. It
Yes.
seems to take the very, I'm going to say the word essence of the person away. And John has talked about this and the grieving process starting much sooner because, I mean, for you, the decline was, quite condensed as opposed to what I thought at the beginning. But what about at the end? Did he die in hospital? I'm sorry, I'm really probing you, and please tell me if it's too much. But
It's fine.
I like to know everything.
He did die in the hospital. Yes. Yes, by this point, he'd had pneumonia, and I could tell from his body that he was dying. I won't go into the details, but he was physically quite disintegrated. And I was taking care of him at home without enough help because he thought he was going to recover. So we didn't. And I was thinking, oh my God, I'm dealing with some open sores and things. I thought, am I killing him? I don't have training in this. And it was frightening. He wouldn't let me get things like a hospital bed. Later, I found out he turned down things like palliative care, which would have been helpful, and all the services the hospital would have offered. And yeah, it was extraordinarily difficult. And then finally, he went into the hospital. And at that point, I was getting ready to get like more in-home care. We had a little bit, but not enough. And when he went into the hospital, I was kind of hoping, honestly, he'd stay for a bit so I could do something to organize our home better for him to come home. And that's when I got a call. He was in an oxygen. He was in an oxygen tent though, and he wasn't. He was just getting worse. And I was actually hoping they'd keep him because he wasn't set up for in-home care. At this point, we have a 911 here with the ambulance, and they had been to our home several times when he'd fallen and he couldn't get up. And it was horrible to watch. I couldn't lift him. And, they finally had to take him away, couldn't breathe right. And it was the first time I'd seen him not doing well. Mentally, he was off. And they took him, and I thought, well, I hope they keep him there a while to get proper care. I can't do this at home. And the next day, I'd gotten a call from his doctor who said, I'm sorry, I'm going to cry. He had this order in place. We couldn't speak to you, but he has a matter of days, maybe weeks. And he died a few days later in the hospital.
Were you able to be there? Did you want to be there?
I visited a few times during about that terrible week. The first people, so at that point, they'd called his parents somehow, and they were there with him. It was extraordinarily difficult. The day he died, he seemed fine. I could understand him in the oxygen tank. Oxygen tent thing, most people couldn't. I could. We understood each other. We smiled. He was making some jokes. It was great. People there from the hospital, because it was a very different kind of situation. In retrospect, I wondered if they were a little concerned for their own liability because, they hadn't told me anything. And in retrospect, that wasn't right. When I look back, I wish I'd been more proactive and pushier. But
first time, right?
First, yeah, hopefully only. And that afternoon, I remember he said, his mother was there and his father, who looked really depleted. And his mother's an extraordinarily strong woman from Chile. She's a nuclear physicist at a time when women didn't do that. Wow. She's a human rights activist. And he looked at me and he said quietly from the tank, go home. He said, if you don't go home, she's not going to go home. I want you all to go home. And I went home, and his mother stayed with him, and he died that afternoon. And she stayed with him when he was gone.
Well, insofar as a good death, to be with your mother who brought you into the world, to be with them at the end, it sounds about as comforting as these things can be. I am so sorry, because 11 years, 11 days, it doesn't matter. The loss is still as enormous. And I've gotten kind of goosebumpy listening to you go back in there. So it will have affected you then. Wow, about his mum. That's really cool.
It's interesting. She's so strong, and she stayed with him, and she.
I think that
was very meaningful to her. I'm a little bummed he sent me home, but that's okay. I've had a lot of time to come to terms with this, and what I figured out is that he lived as he wanted. When he was diagnosed in 2009 and he was still okay, he didn't want to take big vacations. He didn't want to take much time off. He was still on call for the weekends in case Quicken needed him. He was a great mentor and a great person to the people he worked with. And I realized he lived his life as he wanted. One of the most important things to him was this product, they were doing Quicken in the cloud back then. And this was his legacy. This was the work that he wanted to do, to be with these people, to be part of this team. That was what he wanted.
And you're right, we talk about legacy quite a lot. And I think it's Emily's episode. She's another American, and I think you would relate to her episode because her husband was very similar. He was literally in his hospital bed, sending emails and things right up to the end. And
very close. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when I'm very attracted to men who are passionate about what they do and who successful, and I don't necessarily monetarily successful. I just mean people who have overcome something or, are good at what they do or passionate about what they do, because I think that tells you quite a lot about a person. He sounds like an amazing man, just a little stubborn.
He was an amazing man, and he was such a good person. He was the person at work. He was pretty highly ranked, but if someone needed furniture moved, he's there moving furniture,
Yeah, not too proud to lift a table. I like that.
No, he was really humble and really helpful to everybody, even people who are just kind of insufferable. And he was there, and he really worked to build consensus. That was what he was really good at. And he was really a good mentor to people. And it was a very harsh work environment. If somebody got terminated, laid off, he was very good at helping them have recommendations, honest though, to get another job. He really, he was a great person. And on the downside, he was extraordinarily stubborn, and he was a workaholic. I know when I was looking for my second person, one of my big criteria was not a workaholic.
Yeah, I can understand that. And because you were able to retire early, which is a wonderful thing to do, and John is semi-retired as well. He also comes from a tech background. So, and I do this, but it's really, for us, it's been amazing because I think we were building this relationship as adults and with blended children, and it could very easily, if he was still doing this kind of 12-hour long days, I just don't think we'd have got to know each other the way we have. And that time, and actually I couldn't do the school runs I do, for example, if he wasn't around in the daytime. I've got 4 children at 4 different schools. So
wow.
Yeah, I know. And it's I'm very aware that it's a privilege we're lucky to have this time together. But I'm also very aware that we didn't have 20 years before. We didn't do the kind of free dating and, wrong one. Ben and I lived in a tiny little flat in London, and, we both had full-time salaries, and we spent it all on wine and going out. And you can never quite go back and recreate that. So yes, you have a different life now, but I have a wonderful life. But I don't know, I suppose what I'm trying to say is you almost have to cram in a lot of getting to know each other in a shorter space of time when you're older. Not that I'm thinking we're going to die, but it's kind of cards on the table. That's what I'm trying to say. There's no bullshit, is there? You know what you need, you know what you want, and you're not prepared to settle, perhaps. I don't know.
That really resonates with me. I don't have children, and when I met my current partner and we started to date, he's a realtor, and his child was in his 30s and lives far away, so that wasn't an issue. So we weren't dealing with any other constraints, and it was fun because actually at this point I'd been widowed 5 years, and I'd worked through a lot of the guilt and a lot of the pain, and I was having my own life. When I met my partner, I was set to go on a 3-week trip with a tour group of the Eastern Europe.
Wow.
And I was just going to be starting that fall my MFA. I went back to school and got a second graduate degree in writing.
So you didn't just sit around then, painting your nails while in retirement?
For years, I've had years where I don't do much, but this was, I was kind of at the time I was really geared, and I met my partner now, Randall. And he was finishing up. Ultimately, he finished up a job because he was working a tremendous amount he was in a community where he was selling the homes, but that finished up. And we actually did have a lot of time together, and we dated in a very leisurely, kind of romantic fashion where
Nice.
we went out to a lot of dinners and he'd come pick me up where I lived. We lived about a half hour apart. And then ultimately we had a lot of weekends away and we do a lot of day trips. And it was lovely because we actually did have this time. And after a lot of these men I'd met, I come these real schmucks who had no courtesy and no chivalry. It was lovely to meet somebody with manners and sort of take our time and enjoy things. And it was a real balm after both my loss and again, the sort of lack of regard in the men I'd been dating and I'd been meeting.
Yeah, and I think I sort of say sometimes it feels like humanity has gone everywhere, but I think particularly in that dating world, this kind of lack of humanity that we're feeling out in the everyday world. I mean, even just going into the supermarket and things, it's like people have forgot to human. And I suspect that is very much exacerbated in the online dating world. And I know myself that there's I mean, things like, porn websites have got a lot to answer for, because I know like the men who are coming back in, having a second go, should we say, divorced, however they're single, the expectation of what you were going to do or what you might enjoy doing was very different. And I just think it's a very chauvinistic, patriarchal word out there. But then I've spoken to men who say that women are just as bad on the dating site. So perhaps I shouldn't tar them all with the same brush. But yeah, I think having a standard or expectation of what you want, I didn't want another man. I didn't want another child. I had enough children. Oh, actually, I did. I got another child, but I didn't want to have to look after a man child. Ben was very independent, and that's what I was attracted to. And then in John, I found that. But then we've had to regroup, I suppose, because we'd only really got together when he got very sick with COVID, and we were sort of forced into a house together. And I had a very sick man. Hearing you bringing home a man who needed care and without any kind of idea of what you were doing, that I experienced that to a certain extent myself. And then having to learn to live in a house with somebody. Now we work together, but so far so good. But it's difficult, but it's exciting. And unfortunately, the young children prevented us having too much of the kind of, romantic dates and nights away. But we do try and get away, and we do have regular babysitters, because otherwise you miss that. And you're just sat watching the telly every night, and you've got to remember that you're a couple. And actually, I think probably children are the impediment there, actually. So what does life look like for you now? You've said that you've moved, so you were near San Francisco. Where are you now? I don't need your full address.
I'm actually still pretty near San Francisco, about an hour away. I live near Napa.
Oh, okay.
And I live it feels like a small town feel by the water. I have a home near the water. It's the Cardenas Straits. It's where I live. And I live in Benicia, which is actually the third state capital of California. And it has a beautiful small downtown. And to me, it reminds me a little bit of maybe a small town in England by the water. And the girl I do yoga next to, actually, she's a mom with 2 kids. She's told me that, and she recently moved to Benicia. She's British. And she said, yes, it does remind her of some towns in England. So my suspicion is correct. I've heard from an actual British person
Must be
that
true
it
then.
does.
I was about to ask you where they were from and see if I knew them. This is what we do all the time. The Brits be like, oh, where are they from? I might know them.
Gosh, I know her name's Kaylee.
No, you don't have to. Don't worry. It's fine.
Okay. But it's lovely here. And I moved into a home that I just love. It has a nice water view, and it's
that's the dream.
Large, and it's wonderful because the home I lived in before in the suburbs, it was very closed in, and in one of these neighborhoods where every third house is the same.
Yeah. And
George had picked it, and we picked it together because when we bought it, we were both working very hard, and we didn't have time to fix anything up. And
renovations.
It was also what we could afford. I'd saved a down payment. I was 30. I'd been working since I was about 24 as a lawyer. We were pretty limited. But he picked the house, and it wasn't my first choice. So it was wonderful later to be able to pick something that I loved, and to fix it up how I wanted to. And my partner's been really supportive of that. We both have similar tastes, and we love fixing stuff up. He's a realtor. He has an amazing eye.
Oh, I see. So you need somebody to do the nitty gritty. It's again, so another similarity really. But Ben and I bought I refer to it as the 80s monstrosity because
Ah,
it wasn't a beautiful house, but it was a 4-bedroom house with a drive and a garden, which in the area I used to live in was quite hard to get. We got it at bargain. But we both used to say this is not our forever home. This is our 5 to 10 year house, and then we'll do it up, and we'll move to an old house. And when he died, his life insurance didn't actually clear the whole mortgage. So what I did is I renovated bits of it, and then I met John. But we have moved from. He was in a modern house. I was in a 1980s house, and the house we have now is actually older than America in places. It's 16th century,
wow.
so it's my dream home. It's quirky. Like, we found there was an extra bedroom off one of the bedrooms when we bought it, which we didn't know about. But we have gone from top to bottom, and every light switch has been chosen. And I just love my house. And it's like it's ingrained with our personality. And with it being such an old house, we are custodians of it. You know, you look in the UK, I don't know about it. Old buildings are protected, so we have a protection order on our building. But yeah, we're right in the village, which is handy with the kids. But the sea is where I think I will end up one day for sure. Not in it, I hope.
Yeah, a water view is very important to me. My partner lived with a beautiful water view in a condominium that was small. And it was funny because during COVID, we'd been together a couple years and we stayed at his place, which was much smaller than mine and was a condo as opposed to a detached home with a yard. But we found his place so much more joyful than mine that when it was over, I realized I'd finished my master's degree. I realized I wanted to live over here. And I do. I can walk to town. It has a really cute, sort of old-fashioned, real cute feeling downtown. And it's walkable.
I'm going to
And
pick your
it's not
brains
as
on this
busy.
because we want to go to the west coast of America. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe get a few little tips here of where we can go. I have a pool to the water. I've always have done, and because with Ben having drowned, I was worried that I would be frightened of it. And initially, I was a little apprehensive. I think you are. It feels like the thing that killed my husband. But actually now I feel very connected to him when I'm near water, and I love that sense of freedom that looking out at the ocean gives you, or a lake, and actually we're about an hour from the coast here. And we have said when we can no longer manage this house, when the kids don't live here, it's a house with a sea view, 100%. That's the dream.
Yeah, I have a bay view. It's kind of like a bay.
That'll do.
We're off the ocean, but it's enough. It works. And we've been fixing up the house. Yes, and it's been fun, and I love it, and it's made a huge difference
And it's
because
something you
it's
do
interesting.
together.
When I lost George, my house didn't feel that like home anymore. It felt like I was living in his house, and I tried to change. Changed a lot of it and remodeled some of it, but
So
it didn't
familiar.
really feel like my house. And I didn't move because I was more focused on getting out of the house as opposed to, and I wanted to know where I wanted to be. I didn't just want to leave. I wanted to have something I was moving to. I needed a reason for that much upheaval. And George was an engineer. So our walls and things were so cut up with putting in Wi-Fi and surround sound and things. I was afraid I would never find a willing buyer, and God knows what I'd have to credit back. Fortunately, this being Northern California, it was during a very popular time for sales. It worked out. But I was afraid my house was unsellable.
When John was in hospital, I
Yeah.
had my friend Lulu, former co-host of the podcast. She came and stayed with me. She broke the lockdown rules, so please don't arrest her. But I'd just been told my partner was going to die, and so we bunkered in together. And he had everything was bloody tech. Even the blinds on every window in the house, you had to have a remote control. Now, I couldn't find a remote control for these blinds. I kid you not, they were open for about 3 days constantly while I looked for the remote. And actually, we're restricted in this house by how much tech we can have. But the radiators are beautiful, antique style radiators, and then they've got a bloody Tado on them. But yes, I can totally understand this need to make something new. And I really wanted to leave my house. I did, because the police knocked on the door. That was a house where my heart broke. And it wasn't a house I felt he was desperately connected to, because it was a stopgap house. So I didn't really feel much guilt or sadness when I moved out. And actually, it's been nice. We were only about 40 minutes from the town that we used to live in. So it's close enough for me to see people if I want to, but also to give the kids the opportunity to start again. And I mean, you talk about making a new network. It is easier with kids because the school runs, that sort of thing. You talk to people, but it's hard. It's hard starting again. And it's hard to build a new network. But it sounds to me like you have taken this awful tragedy that happened to you, and you have made a choice. And we talk about this choice all the time. And the choice is that you are going to grab life by the balls, for want of a better terminology, and grab and pull all the joy from it that you can. And you've got your beautiful house by the sea, and you're in a new relationship, and it's just really nice to see, actually, because as you talk to people who've gone through this journey of recovery, because it is a form of recovery, I love to see those people who have popped out the other side. And I'm not saying that you're not grieving and that you're never going to feel sad again, because you know that you will, but you've chosen not to sit in that and to. I've said, like, I'm 43. At best, I've got half my life left. Do I want to stare at a wall and cry, or do I want to see the world, show my children what exists out there, show them that you can overcome adversity? And I think that's what each and every one of us is doing. We're all showing other people that the terrible things happen, and it doesn't mean the end for everybody, for the person that died, obviously. But and I think by doing these stories, because I know a lot of our listeners aren't widowed, but it's having a real impact into the outside world. And I'm so proud of my guests for doing this. And I'm really, really proud of you for getting up at 5 o'clock to do it.
Thank you so much. Yes, that was hard this morning. Yes.
I meant to email.
I'm amazed I'm coherent and I don't have huge bags under my eyes.
Not in the slightest.
But, just to go back to what you said, I agree, because I was very unhappy when my husband died, and I was very isolated, and I was sitting on my living room floor, and I was drinking alone at night after I was doing all the admin-y stuff during the days. And, I'd lost my mom at 10. I was 50 when I lost my husband. He was 53. And I really felt like, well, do I live in a hostile universe? What's next? I'm so isolated. And I realized that, at one point I was I'd cleared up, most of the estate stuff. So I didn't have all that to keep me busy. And I could stop terrorizing the people at the bank. And I realized I had a choice. My role model is my father, because he lost my mom when he was 42. And he went on to make a wonderful life for himself and for me as a single parent. And I looked at this and I said, well, I'm sitting here, and I said, but I have a choice. I'm healthy. 50 is young. I was certainly in good shape because all I did was exercise. I was very fortunate in that I wasn't going to lose my house. I had enough resources that for the foreseeable future, I was going to be fine. If necessary, I had a dad and a stepmom who could help me. And I looked at this and I said, well, you're either going to be miserable for the rest of your life, or you can do something, you can get up and you can start with something. And that I had a lot of choices.
I've just written down the time of that, because I'm going to quote that up, because that is so true. You have that. It is a choice that you have to make, and people can support you. They can help you. They can offer you assistance, but I liken it to kind of a rope ladder being thrown down a well. Yes. They can't climb out of it. They can give you the ladder, but you have to do that climbing yourself. And actually, I don't know whether you might be interested in coming back on at some point, because I am cultivating an offshoot podcast where I speak to people who lost a parent young, and how it was for them at the time, and how things have changed, how they are now. But I won't keep you too much now. I'll speak to you off the microphone about this. It's meant to be a positive thing to show people who are perhaps freshly widowed and have children that they're going to be all right, or, they can be all right. I'm aware not all are. But anyway, that's a complete digression. I do apologise. Just quickly, could you just remind everybody the name of your book and also your blog, if you're still happy for people to go? I know you said you haven't written for a while, but it might be useful for people still, floating around in the weeds out there.
Sure. The name of my book is Available As Is, because older singles we're like fancy. We're like your home, right? We're available as is, like fine real estate, right? We have our quirks.
We've got a few quirks and a few cracks.
Exactly. So my book is called Available As Is, A Midlife Widow's Search for Love. You can get it in the UK. It's also
checked.
Kindle Limited. It's a bargain. I have it on Kindle Unlimited.
I've got it on Kindle Unlimited. I downloaded it yesterday. There you go.
And it's funny. It's actually funny, because a lot of this was funny. Dating again was funny, and looking at the world differently did have a certain surrealism to it. So it's Available As Is, A Midlife Widow's Search for Love. I don't blog anymore, but you can find my old blog entries on my website, debbieweissauthor.com. Here in the US, there's another widowed author named Debbie R. Weiss. I am not Debbie R. Weiss. She is a brunette. I'm Debbie Weiss, the blonde.
What are the chances?
I'm there on the website looking blonde. So I'm Debbie Weiss, author, and my blog and my old blog entries are there. And I've written a fair amount on, for some magazines, and I had something in the Huffington Post this past year.
You've got quite the CV, and I was having a little look at some places you've been published, and I was quite jealous. So congratulations on that as well, because I'm a writer by trade, and I've struggled since Ben died. So I find speaking is my outlet now, and but I hope one day, that's my dream, is to write a book. Whether it's a guide, whether it's an autobiography, I don't know yet, but I feel that urge to do something written. So maybe one day, maybe I'll come to you for some advice. But in the meantime, I will read your book, because I wish, and I wish I'd found it sooner. But for everybody else listening out there, if you have any questions that have been raised from this episode, you know where I am. You can send me messages at Instagram, which is widowed_AF. Or you can find us on the website, which is www.widowedaf.com. But for now, Debbie, I'm going to thank you ever so much for coming on and telling your story. Is there anything else you wanted to share? Have we missed anything? I don't like to leave anybody with unanswered business.
I think we've covered everything, but my message is very much, and it's in my book as well, is that despite everything, there's hope. Yeah. Because I found hope. And when this first happened to me, I did not have hope.
No.
But through taking small steps forward, they started to add up to much more.
Yeah.
And that gave me hope to move forward. So that's part of what I want to offer.
And actually, that is exactly what I want to do with this podcast, is I want to give people hope. And I didn't think, because, sorry, I'm going to keep talking now, aren't I, after I've just started the sign off. It's when by talking, excuse me, in that beginning bit, you do lose your hope. You have to. And actually, I had to very quickly stub out any glimmer of hope, because he was lost. But I had to very quickly accept he was dead. And hope is something that I had lost. I thought I would live. I thought I would provide for my kids and be there for my kids, but I felt like I would live a half life, and that I was going to be sad forever. And as hope kind of gradually began to, glimmer into my life, I know that I realized how important it is to have hope. And I think that's a really, really powerful message. And I didn't think that we would attract people in the early stages of grief. I thought it'd be a bit too dark humored, and much like you, available as is, Widowed AF, it's to kind of, I suppose your vibe attracts your tribe. But yeah, and the fact you said the book is funny, this is what we try and do here, is to try and smash the stereotype a little bit and show that we're still funny, we're still smart, we're still, we still have fun. It just so happens that we went through an unspeakable tragedy that we are now speaking about. And with that, I'm going to shut up. So thank you ever so much, Debbie. And I wish you so much love and happiness as you embark on this, or continue on this next journey of your life. So lots of love, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Rosie, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Take care. And to everybody out there, we'll be back on Friday to have a little chat about Debbie's episode and whatever else has been going on that week. But for now, you take care. Goodbye.